Yeah, he got his yesterday.
Okay, I saw it.
That's short.
Okay. And you want that? You said you don't. Okay, so I'll grab both of those, mine of those for this week, and then we'll find out. Let's chat. Did you already get your money out there? You got your, who's is that? You got yours?
I don't know.
I knew two others that wanted it, so I'll just ask them if no one else.
Nobody wants to.
Yeah, so I know Kevin has, she's on, so does Carson, so I'll just split it up between them and let them have it. They can argue. Yeah, I can't believe I've never noticed that. Unless the one that wasn't original, one they were working on, that one was right.
Did you look at these to see what's?
Oh no, I don't have your, yeah, I bet it's the same, because I think the one I looked at was the front one she handed out. All right?
No.
I'm curious what it is in the back. Yeah, she should be out and about on starting Tuesday. Just open. Yeah, to the bull, yeah.
Morning.
She's doing a lot better. She's been trying to get hold of me. And she called the director, he texted me, I looked at the director today, the phone number's wrong.
Did you change that to bulletin?
Actually, no, the bulletin's right. It's the director that's wrong. Yeah, that's it, yeah. It says 92 in the director. All right. Yeah. All right. Good morning. It's good to see everyone this morning. We're going to go ahead and get started. We're going to be in 2 Samuel chapter 8 this morning. 2 Samuel chapter 8. As we continue through our study of David. As we know, he's getting a little bit of an age, but he's starting to, today he actually finishes his whole kingdom. You know, they're actually able to establish the whole kingdom. They get everything that God said that they would get was promised to Abraham. So before we get into that, let's go ahead and jump into our questions. our questions. We'll start with the first one. Where did Jesus and the apostles go after they left the upper room? In Mark 14:32. Where did they go? They went to Gethsemane, the Garden of Gethsemane. And what did Jesus do there in the Garden of Gethsemane? He prayed. What did the apostles do? They slept. Exactly right. All right. Even though Jesus asked them to stay awake, and it wasn't just once, it was more than once that he went back to them. But what did the apostles do when Jesus had been captured? It actually says they forsook him and fled. Yeah, so they actually forsook Jesus. Meaning they don't want anything to do because they're afraid they were going to be next. And they thought it was actually what at that point? They thought it was over. They thought everything was done. Exactly right. Let's go on to the next one. On the seventh day, the Sabbath, what were the Israelites to do? Rest. Pretty simple. Yep, just rest. It's all not your question. Was David pleased with the men who had murdered Ishbosheth? No, not at all. He was very upset with them, with what they did. How did the people feel about David? They loved him. They loved David. They liked him so much. Yeah, they loved him immensely. What's that?
They saw his past achievements, victories, of course, through God.
Exactly right.
They've seen his military, leadership before.
Yep. Yeah, they seen him from the beginning, really, of his time, after everything he was doing. And remember, they were divided. He was over Judah for 7.5 years. Now he's over everything, of course, once again, and it's great to see that. Israel anointed David what? 2 Samuel 5:3. King. Exactly right. Simple. Each time before going against the Philistines, what did David do? Verse 19 and verse 23 of chapter 5. He prayed for God for basically, what do I need to do? And God made it very clear, go after them, go ahead, go get them, and he did that as he would, and that's a very important thing for David to see. Okay, sometimes he didn't do it, which you made a big mistake not doing that, which this is one of them. Why did Uzzah die? He touched the Ark of the Covenant, and I always add to that because David didn't explain the rules, or David didn't know the rules or the commandments of God himself, and we know later when he went back, learned that and got things right. How did David celebrate the arrival of the ark into his city? Exactly. He danced, they praised, singing songs, and so on. And then we jump from here into the last one. God said he had dwelled in a blank since he has brought the children of Israel out of Egypt. In a tent, exactly right, which we know would be the tabernacle. 2 Samuel 7:6. That's not 17, that's 7. David's saying that the Lord is his blank and he will not want. The Lord is his shepherd. We went over that on Wednesday night, exactly, Psalm chapter 1, and I went through those areas. All right, so today it's titled David's Victories, and that's what we're looking at, David's victories that take place here in 2 Samuel 8, 1 through 18. It's like I said, it's only 18 verses, but we have enough here to cover to keep some class the whole time. As we look at this, we know that David's basically his kingdom expands. And I want you to notice how big this kingdom is. And this kingdom goes all the way back to what God has said. Remember, he talked about the Euphrates River, which is right here. We're bordered the Euphrates River, which we see it doing. Border the top lands up here, all along the Mediterranean. These areas they could not take, and we'll talk about that as we get into that. But it's a very vast area. And this is the area that, of course, we passed on to Solomon, his son, that he would have his kingdom later down the road. So as we look at this 2 Samuel 8, we're going to begin looking at verse 1 through 6 in a minute. But our examination of the life of David, as we know, continues throughout the study and continues this morning, of course. And that the 8th chapter of 2 Samuel contains a lot of history, is really what it was. Melissa was asking this morning, she was preparing, had her class on the way, and she was reading it again, and she goes, I wonder what, really, for the kids, there's not a whole lot of teachers except for David killed a lot of people right now. I mean, he killed a lot of people and took over his kingdom. And I said, yeah, it's all about his victories at this point. It's about closing that chapter of Israel and basically having a kingdom with freedom, with safety, and peace. And that's the most important part that we see happening here. So as we look at these powerful lessons, when God makes a promise, this is what I believe probably one of the most important lessons of this lesson here in chapter 18, is that when God makes a promise, nothing or no person can ruin the promise God makes. Nobody at all. God's promises are going to come true without a doubt. At the end of chapter 7, we see what God had promised David. Before we get into chapter 8, let's go and remind ourselves here. If someone will read for us 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 29, please.
Now therefore it please you to bless the house of your servant, so that it may continue forever before you, for you, O Lord God,
Thank you. So we see this is what's going to happen, that we see this promise is going to come, that they'll be blessed forever. And it's just a real important process we see moving on to chapter 8. And what this does is this reminds us all the way back to Genesis, where this promise was made to Abraham, as we know, as we find here in Genesis chapter 12. Come on, turn for me. There we go. Genesis chapter 12, verse 1 through 3. If someone read this to remind us of what went on with Abraham.
Now the Lord had said to Abram, get out of your country, for your family, and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great. And you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curse you. And in you all, the families of the earth shall be blessed.
Thank you. This is a lot like what we just read in 2 Samuel 7. The blessings that are found there. And the promise is basically made to Abraham through God that would go on from their generations to the people of Israel, of course, and then finally, of course, to us, as we would see that as the church. But also in Genesis 15, I want us to look at this, verse 5 through 6. If someone read this for us, please.
And he brought him outside and said, look toward heaven and number the stars. If you are able to number them, then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. And he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness.
Thank you. I doubt Abraham went out. I mean, he may have started to count, but I doubt he counted too long, very long. Anybody that's gone out, if you ever tried it as a child, probably, you got to start counting 1, 2, 3, you get to about 10, you're like, uh-oh, where was I at? And you've got to start over again. You see it, the stars are just a numeral. We don't know how many there are. And that's the whole point, is that, this was going to be blessed all the way to the end of time, as we see with those that would come through the family of God. So God promised Abraham that all of Canaan would be part of Israel, all of it, every bit of it. And now here in chapter 8, that's beginning to happen. It would be for them, we know, the only place they had to take, that they had to continue to do was Jerusalem. They took it. Then they started taking the northern areas up near Syria and so on. We're going to see this morning. And of course, the one area they could never establish, we said a moment ago, was the Philistine area. They beat the Philistines, but they allowed the Philistines to live, and we see that little pocket where we showed a minute ago, which I'll show you again later. So let's jump into 2 Samuel 8, verses 1 through 3. If someone going to read that for us, please.
After this, it came to pass that David attacked the Philistines and subdued them. And David took Betheg Ammah from the hand of the Philistines. Then he defeated Moab. Forcing them down to the ground, he measured them off with a line. With 2 lines, he measured off those to be put to death, and with 1 full line, those to be kept alive. So the Moabites became David's servants and brought tribute.
Thank you. So in other words, what David's doing here, we know, is he's setting, a place saying, everybody from this way up, they're gone, and everyone back here will be basically servants, is what's going to happen for them through Israel. So David what he's doing here is he's sending out the conquerors, we know, all the, we'll go and finish 3, David, I'm sorry.
David also defeated Hadadezer, the son of Rehob, king of Zobah, as he went to recover his territory at the river Euphrates.
Thank you. So as we were saying, David is setting out to conquer the pagan worshiping Canaanites. They were all pagan worshipers, and God did not want them being together, even though we know there are a few problems, as we've seen already in the tribes there. In the west, it will be the Philistines, as we see this moment. Let me get this map up here. In the west, it will be the Philistines, in the east, the Moabites, to the north, northeast, Syrians, and then the south is Edomites. As you notice here, it's all of them basically you find. This is where they take off from, of course, Amalekites, Edomites, Philistines over here that they will find, Moabites down south, Ammonites here, and all the way up to the Syrians. And this is the area that he will take, as I showed you just a minute ago, up along the Euphrates River. And actually this actually turns a little bit, comes up a little higher by when it's all said and done. Hamath is an area that we find that they'll actually bow down to David in a sense. We'll look at that in a minute. To God, as we see, looking what David has done. So that's really the extent of what we find with David's area. We also understand that, as we see here, that this will be the expansion of David's kingdom for everybody to see. However, we must remember this. All of this will happen. All of this is going to happen because of the promise that God made to Abraham. That's where it all starts. That's why we wanted to read Abraham again. And remember, he promised Abraham that he would take all this area. And Abraham didn't do it, of course, and we know that others didn't do it. Moses didn't do it. Joshua didn't do it. David finished it up, is what we see here. And that's a huge thing, because a lot of times we think, before that Joshua took everything. They took the majority of it, but didn't finish it. And that's what we see coming through David. So it's a very simple lesson. Once again, when God makes a promise, nothing or anybody can ruin that promise. Nobody can take it away. It's going to happen, and we see this now. Even though, notice, it was promised to Abraham. Here you're talking, years later, and you're talking all this time later, as we see here and how important it is. So there are many promises, of course, found in the Bible, and when God says something, it's going to happen. But it may not happen in our, in your lifetime, is what we're saying. Really, for us, the next thing to happen is what? What is the next promise left to happen?
Return.
And that is Jesus returning. Exactly right. And that may not happen in our lifetime. It might happen in our lifetime. We don't know, but this is how it's been throughout the Bible. God is on a totally different time schedule than everybody else. And if you notice, the majority of what usually happens in the Bible with God's timetable, it has to do a lot with what's going on in the area, what's going on during that time. And God knew when to bring those things just right. It's just like the establishment of the church. It was, people say, why did God wait so long? Because it was the perfect timing. The Roman Empire, as bad as they were, they did a lot of good for the church because, I'll get to you, David, because they opened up the areas of travel. It was safer to travel and so on. They did roads, they did ways through boats, and so it allowed the Word of God to do what? Well, to expand throughout all the Mediterranean world. And so we see that God has His timetable for everything. David, go ahead.
I was just going to elaborate what you were saying. That's Galatians 4:4. In the fullness of time, God sent forth His Son, born of a woman, born under the law. The fullness of time, that was the perfect time. Like you said, with the Roman roads, the Greek universal language, that was a factor too.
Yeah.
The law, each of those empires that Daniel talked about, or that was in that dream, Nebuchadnezzar's dream, each of those contributed something that was leading to that point.
Yep.
With the laws, the Medo-Persians, they had that law that was eventually, carried through. Greek language, the Roman roads. So God's timing was the perfect time for the Savior to come into the world.
It was. And that's what we see. There had to be unity in a sense under something, and that's what we see all that with the Roman Empire, the Greek language, and so on. And even though, remember, we see God using, here is a terrible, terrible kingdom. Just horrible. We saw what they did to Christians and so on, what they were doing to people all over the place, but God was still able to use them to His benefit. And that's what we see happening here. It's kind of like today, in our country, we look at the time of the Roman Empire, the church was growing stronger. Then the problem would happen with the Roman Empire. They got involved in basically Roman Catholicism. We see later down the road, 300 starts, but Pope not until 600 AD. But you see that started causing problems, and people started moving away from God, actually. And that's kind of what we look at in our own country today. We pray that people are getting closer to God as they should, but it doesn't always seem like that. And it seems like we have many churches throughout the brotherhood, if you keep up with the country, what's happening, so on, that churches that are closing. They're having to close their doors, and we know that many churches have very few people attending them. And people have asked this question, will there come a time? Will there come a time before Christ comes back that the whole church will be gone? Some people believe the church will not survive. But as David just said, it's exactly right. The answer is no, they're wrong. The church is going to last until the end of time. And we go, how do we know that? Well, we have verses like this in the book of Matthew. Matthew chapter 16, 18, where Jesus said these words. If someone's going to read this for us, please.
And I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it.
Thank you. Y'all were just on exact. I was like, don't stop. That sounded so cool. It's like stereo. But yes, it means try more often. No, it's so true as we see this verse here. Jesus made it very clear. I will build my church, and basically nothing's going to happen to it. Notice, not even the gates of Hades. Nothing's going to prevail against it whatsoever. Nothing's going to win against the church. And brethren, we need to understand that we know things are going to happen in this world, and the church, some churches, that's going to take place. It's going to take place throughout all the time. It's going to happen until the end of time, but the church will always be here somewhere. It's kind of like when we go back from David, and you go forward, to the time of after the church. We see it being established in AD 33, and then it seems like for a while, they set up the Roman Empire. It seems like the church kind of fizzles out, but it didn't. There's always a remnant somewhere. That's what the Bible reminds us of. There's always a remnant. So that's the principle that we see in 2 Samuel chapter 8 as David expands his kingdom that this is all about the fulfillment of a promise God made to Abraham, and that it was specifically, basically designed for Israel, is what would happen. And then I would say specifically done after that for us, the church, as we see. So understand, the promise Jesus made about the church doesn't mean that everything will always look great, in the church, because that's not the case. Because the church is, what do you have, the church is the people, of course, and people are humans, and humans sin. And there's things that happen, and we see that. And, and sometimes, not just sin, but just things just don't take place right. And that happens, and we know that. How do we know that? Well, Paul told Timothy about this in 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 1. He reminded him of this, and we're going to read this for us, please.
Now the Spirit expressly says that in the latter times some will depart from the faith, giving heed to deceiving spirits and doctrines of demons.
Thank you. Now, in this sense here, he's talking about those who fall away. They're following things that weren't right. Just because the church, may not make it, doesn't mean that people are bad or evil and everything. We know things happen sometimes, and some churches will. Get so small they'll actually move and be part of another congregation bigger. We see that, and just things go on from there, and we see this happening. So, in 1 Thessalonians, another great verse, I believe the New Testament reminds us of this, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 13, 18, that the church will survive. If someone go and read this for us, please.
But I do not want you to be ignorant, brethren, concerning those who have fallen asleep, lest you sorrow as others who have no hope. For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so God will bring with him those who sleep in Jesus. For this is said to you by the word of the Lord, that you who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord will by no means precede those who are asleep. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout and with the voice of an archangel and with the trumpet of God. And the dead in Christ will rise first, and then we all alive and remain shall be called up together with them in the cloud to meet the Lord in air. And thus we shall always be with the Lord. Therefore, comfort one another with these words.
Thank you. So as we see this here, basically what we find, he says that those who are alive and remaining, we know he's talking about those who are of the church, as we would find there on earth. And so, remember, we read that Jesus comes back to take his church out of this world. That's what he's talking about here. And so we ask, will evil triumph, as it seems like it does so often? The answer to that is no. Jesus' church will triumph. The purpose of God will triumph. And that's what we see with David in 2 Samuel chapter 8. That even though everything was going on, how bad and difficult it was at times, they would prevail. They would make it through this. In fact, verse 4 tells us a little more about this. So someone go and read verse 4 for us, please.
David took from him 1,000 chariots, 700 horsemen, and 20,000 foot soldiers. Also David hamstrung all the chariot horses, except that he spared enough of them for 100 chariots.
Thank you. So as we see here, it's talking about what David took from the ones we mentioned in verses 1 and 3. We may ask, why did David do this to the horses? And they're gone. You're not going to use them anymore. Hamstrung Israel. This is what it is. Israel, number one, was not a place for chariots. It just wasn't, because chariots were best on what kind of ground? Flat ground. Without a doubt, we see that. And that is a very rocky area there. Even on the roads, it's very rocky. We see that. And so there was no need for 1,000 of them. Besides that, so David keeps 100 of them. And all this happening, David knew that where the real power was found. He did not want people to start depending on objects as their ancestors did all the way back to Egypt. Egypt was a chariot nation, a chariots with horses and so on. David wanted them to look, we need to be relying on God as our weapon. God is going to do this, not these weapons of man-made things that are here, even though we know they have swords and so on. But these other things, what happens? Once they start relying on other things, they stop relying on who? God. And that's what we see with many countries over time. And you become so powerful, so strong, and you wonder about our country sometimes, if that's not what happens sometimes. The people get to that point thinking, look what we have done, Americans, USA. But no, it doesn't. Look what God has done for us and keeps us where we are. David, go ahead.
I was going to say, that passage in Deuteronomy, I can't remember exactly where, but the regulations for the king, he wasn't allowed to multiply horses either.
Yep.
Maybe David had finally started looking, because he hadn't looked at that before, maybe per per se, but maybe he had started looking at that more now as he's king. Okay, I'm not allowed to do this.
Right.
I'm not allowed to have the multiply horses.
Yep, because in that same verse, we read that before, we're talking about multiplying wives and horses and all that. And yeah, and David, it's interesting what we said with the Ark of the Covenant. Did he really understand how you were supposed to transport it? Did he go back to reading things? That's exactly right. You start figuring things out again. Because the old book, the Old Testament would have been around, of course, for them. Very important to see that. So 2 Samuel 8, let's move on, verses 5 through 6. Appreciate that. And it says these words. If someone go ahead and read for us, please.
When the Syrians of Damascus came to help Hadadezer, king of Zobah, David killed 22,000 of the Syrians. Then David put garrisons in Syria of Damascus, and the Syrians became David's servants and brought tribute. So the Lord preserved David wherever he went.
Thank you. This is a big thing, because the Syrians were tough people. I mean, they were tough and rough, and they were pretty much unbeatable is what it seemed like. That's why they thought without a problem, hey, we're just going to go on down there to Damascus. We're going to go ahead and help King Hadadezer that, that David's already basically conquered in a sense, and or conquering them. They think they're going to win, and they don't. So we see what happens here. I mean, think about it. David, it says him and his men killed 20,000 of the Syrians. And remember, David, when he goes to these wars, we think, oh, he probably has hundreds of thousands. Usually, David in his wars, he would fight with those 30,000 men that were very strong. They were like our special forces. We said is really the way these men were. They were unbelievable, but it really wasn't their power; it was the power of who? Power of God. Once again, exactly. So what you have here, you have some strategic control taking place with David. We know the placement of the garrisons. Those garrisons are military posts. And and even we as America learned about this very soon. We learned this when we would fight in wars in different places, and the only way to keep peace usually is what did we have to do? We placed a base there, exactly right. We had people there that did not leave. And then that's where you have those deployments going on, and we see that, those garrisons. And that's what it is. It's the whole, the main thing of it was not just control, because as America, we always gave it back to them. We actually went and rebuilt, after the wars and so on. But it was to keep peace in those areas, peacekeepers and so on. And a reminder that, look, if something happens, we're here to take care of it. You don't want to do anything. So in Damascus, it allowed David to control a key trade and military hub. That's what this was all about here, because they go in and out all the way around the Euphrates, come back down to where used to be, all that area, Babylon and so on. So we see this. So you also have this expansion. The victory was part of David's expansion, securing territory, as we said, as far as the Euphrates River, and that basically fulfilled at that moment the land promise that God gave Abraham. That's what that was all about. Significance here, why is it so significant? Because the Syrians became David's servants. They hadn't been servants to anybody since their time, and now they are. We see this happening and bringing tribute as he established dominion over this region. So they're bringing stuff and saying, "Yep, we don't want to be enemies with David. We want to be what? We want to be allies. We want to be friends with him." Exactly right. And they may not want to be friends, but they want to definitely be allies. They want to basically we'll do whatever you say just so we get along here. And that's what we have. We've seen the same thing with us quite a bit in our country. Once again, just a map to remind you of this area of where we have what's happening. Like I said, the Syrians are up here, and that would be basically, as we find right above, you see a Galilee. That would take place right about all this area is what he would control with the Syrians. We also know, when we listen to David, what his inspired words were in Psalms here in this verse. Very important verse, where this is where we know what David was just saying, that David realizes it now. He catches everything. He's reading God's word better. He's doing what needs to be done. So I'm going to read this for us, please.
Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we will remember the name of the Lord our God.
Thank you. You wonder how often this was quoted, talked about in different things, reminding the people, look, it's not man-made objects, it's not things that man's used, to control things. Because the thing about chariots and horses was so big, usually the person that had more chariots and more horses, they were going to welcome the war. They were going to win. And they'd run you right over with those things. And they were fast, very, very, very easy to control in a sense. And we say easy, easy enough for them as we see during those times. And David said, don't put your trust there. Our trust needs to be in God, because that's where everything is. So David understood the real cause of the triumph of Israel over all this land and the military success. It was in the promise of God, and he knew how the Jewish people were, that the Jewish people, we've seen this from time and time again, very fickle, a fickle, as we would say, kingdom or people. And it always reminds me when I read about the Israelites and I think about things like this. And there are times in our country where you see, I've said it many times, in our country, Americans are very fickle. They really are. They change that quick. And you think about 9/11, I think back to that. After 9/11 happened, what did you see go up on houses, on the front of houses, everywhere? American flag. So, everybody was buying one. Everybody was putting one up, for a country. And that lasted maybe 5, 6 months, 7, and then you see, guess what starts happening? They don't replace them, and it just disappears. And, that's kind of forgetting, of what our country goes through and what it is. And we go, why do they remind it every year? And that's it, as we see that. So here's the same thing with David. David knew that the people were fickle. He knew that they would forget things all the time. They want to replace left and right. He says, so I need the people to remember, nothing is done without God. Everything is done with Him. And so we see this next point. This is what the people learn. What David learns is that everything belongs to God. Most kings, when they won in a war victory, and they would take, they called it the booty, they would take everything that was there, and they would usually keep it for who? Themselves, exactly right. They, a lot of times they didn't share it with, with people. Maybe some of their hierarchy, and so on, but they would keep it. They would keep all this gold and silver and so on. And David's going to make a point here and show, look, we've won all this gold, even the chariots that were no longer, a lot of them were probably made with, gold blade and so on, taking that off and so on. And he says, we're not going to keep it. Everything belongs to God. And the people needed to see this. So let's go ahead and read here, beginning in verse 7, 7 through 14. And whoever reads this, if you'll stop at the end there, I'm going to go forward and look at a couple of these places and where they're at. So someone read this, please.
And David took the shields of gold that had belonged to the servants of Hadazir and brought them to Jerusalem, also from Betah and from Berothai, cities of Hadazir. King David took a large amount of bronze. When Toi, king of Hamath, heard that David had defeated all the army of Hadazir, then Toi sent Joram, his son, to King David to greet him and bless him.
Okay, thank you. So let's go and look at these. I'll have you keep reading just a second, Marshall. So these are the areas that he's talking about. Remember, Hamath is the area to the left of Syria. So it's the area that they didn't conquer. But David didn't have to take that area because God, that wasn't part of the land promise, but in a sense it did, because we just read a moment ago, we see here that Hamath is going to come and become an ally of David. And David and them could go in there, trade, do whatever the Israelites do, whatever they needed to do, but they were not supposed to mix with him. That would be anything outside of God's way of the people. So this, we don't know 100%. This is where most scholars believe Betah is located at, and Betah would be at right in this area. And this is Hamath, as we said, over here below the Euphrates River and to the left of it, as you saw earlier. Okay, let's see. And never mind, it's there again. There's Hamath, as you see, all this area here. That's why this area of the Sidonians wasn't taken, because of the oath that was made between David and Hamath, and as to be allies together. Marshall, you go and continue to read, please.
Because he had fought against Hadazir and defeated him, for Hadazir had been at war with Toi, and Joram brought with him articles of silver, articles of gold, and articles of bronze. King David also dedicated these to the Lord, along with the silver and gold that he had dedicated from all the nations which he had subdued.
Now, before I go and have more reading further, notice what's happening now. Earlier, David had to fight people with the war to get, and to receive his gold and silver and so on, and give it to God. Now he's not even having to do what to get it. Not even having to fight. And we see this, and this is where God is taking care of them. And remember, we look at all this gold. I've had people ask you, where did all that go? What is David actually, in a sense, not God hasn't told you, what is he in a sense doing at this point? Collecting what? Collecting for what? For the temple. Remember, what was the temple? It was all made of cedar. We see all this on, but what was it overlaid in? Gold. And so they needed so much gold. And so we see this happening as this will take place. Marcia, if you go ahead and continue to read there for us.
From Syria, from Moab, from the people of Ammon, from the Philistines, from Amalek, and from the spoil of Hadazir, the son of Rehob, king of Zobah. And David made himself a name when he returned from killing 18,000 Syrians in the valley of Salt. He also put garrisons in Edom. Throughout all of Edom, he put garrisons, and all the Edomites became David's servants, and the Lord preserved David wherever he went.
Okay, thank you. Someone was saying this a minute ago. He said, how many Syrians did he kill earlier? Did it say 18 or say 20? 20,000. Now we look at this, we go, what is this? This is a different fight. This is a fight that was way south, where there must have been more there. We also understand Damascus. In fact, let me show you this area of where it's at. This is the Valley of Salt. So this is the Dead Sea. This is where you have the end of the Dead Sea, and I'll show you, remind you that. So there's the Dead Sea right here where the Edomites are, and here you find the Dead Sea in this location. But as you go back, they fought in this area of the Valley of Salt. This is what it looks like today. This is the area of the Dead Sea. You see, this is all salt that you find. And if anybody's ever been there to the Jerusalem area and you've ever been on the Dead Sea, what is the craziest thing about the Dead Sea you do once you get in it? You float. You can't sink because of so much salt. However, also your body cannot be in there that long because what happens, your body absorbs the salt. So we see that. So it's just a remarkable thing that we find here. And so this is where this fight happened, as we see here, it takes place. In these verses, David captures the wealth, the shields, the articles made of silver, gold, and bronze. And once again, what did David do with all these valuable items? Well, verse 10 tells us he gave it to the house of God and put it in there. And he gives them over to God. And this is God's wealth. Now, here's what's so amazing. They're not using this yet. You know, they have this already. And they're still, remember, you still have the tabernacle is what you have, David City. Everybody around now knows how rich Israel is. And I mean, what a perfect kingdom to go steal from, you know, to go take stuff from. However, people don't do it because they know they're being protected by who? As David says, by God. And he wants the people to know that. You know, and David made this very clear to everybody. You know, it wasn't his men, it wasn't David, it was God that did all this, and they need to understand it. So he gives them over to God, God's wealth. This was God's doing. David sees, even in his conquest, even in his expansion of his kingdom, all the triumphs, all the gains, everything is because of God. All this is there with it, everything dedicated to God from the war. Everything we have, this we need to understand for us too, everything we have is not really ours. Even though we say, you know, if you tell somebody, you show them your house, what do you say? You say, this is your house? Look at my house. You know, this is my house. And we see his parent. We understand that. We understand that. And God gives us those things. But what we understand is God tells us that we are stewards of the things that God owns himself, really, as we find that God even owns you and I. And we need to think about it that way. Everything we have belongs to him. Giving our means to God is really, let me say it again, giving our means to God is really the most important key to financial success, without doubt. Don't think I'm saying if you give to God a big amount, you're going to become what? Rich. I'm not saying that, as a lot of these televangelists do, you know, to say, you send us $10,000, we'll make you $1 million in a year. You know, I mean, that's not the way it works. What I'm saying, though, is God, you know, he commands us to give to him, you know, to give to the work of the church, and then we are blessed, and we see that, and he will continue to bless us. Poverty, debts, and financial crisis are mostly due to people's attitude, you know, a lot of times about giving to God. And that's a true statement. We go, how can you say that, Ernie? Because you look at the history of the Bible. The Bible is very clear about it. We see from examples we read. You know, a lot of Christians at times either do not know about giving the way they should, or they ignore it. And we need to understand that is one of the commands given to us to see. And it's a great thing because it continues the church. You know, God in all of his wisdom understood where we were going to be, understood what society was going to be like. And it seems like the society we're living in just keeps getting more and more what? Expensive to live in. Expensive, very expensive. We see that. And I always think it's funny, you know, like prices, you know, you think back, I was looking at something the other day back in the 80s, you know, Melissa and I got married, and I think back then I said, wow, we had a house on the beach. It was 10 acres we were renting, and it was, we had 250 yards of private beach right there in Washington State. Looked out, we could see Mount Rainier during the clear days, the Olympic Mountains during that time. And someone looks at you, it was only a one-bedroom house, it was more like a cottage or a little shack, I would say. But you know, you look at that, you would think nowadays something like that would cost what do you think to rent? One bedroom, one bath, you know, kitchen, dining room, dining room, living room together. What do you think it would cost nowadays? How much? $2,000 a month. I figured more than that. Washington State, I know how it's crazy. We're paying $350 a month. I mean, that, you know, that's back in the 80s. We see things just constantly going up. So God understood this in his wisdom that the church was going to need financial things to just continue. And I'm not going to bark and burn on that, but that's what we see. I want to show you an example of David. David got that and understood what God was going to need, which brings us now to verses 9 and 10. If someone going to read this for us, please.
When Toy, king of Hamath, heard that David had defeated all the army of Hadadezer. Then Toi sent Joram, his son, to King David to greet him and bless him because he had fought against Hadadezer and defeated him. For Hadadezer had been at war with Toi, and Jehoram brought with him articles of silver, articles of gold, and articles of bronze.
Thank you. Once again, just continue being taken care of. You know, as we see submitting to God's king, that's the way that people are looking at this, that David is God's king and he's doing right. And if you're on the border of that nation, you want to make sure you're good with them, and that's what we see happening. Which brings us now to knowing that God will provide justice for his people. I'm going to go and start reading some in a couple minutes. Plus, these are all names, but I don't want to read them anyway. But verses 15 through 18. So David reigned over all of Israel, and David administered judgment and justice. Notice to all people that justice, we think of that word meaning, you know, judging them. It's not it. It means being justice, everybody being treated the same. That's what this is at. Joab, the son of Zeruiah, was over the army. Jehoshaphat, the son of Eliab, was the recorder. Zadok, the son of Ahitub, and Ahimelech, the son of Abadar, were the priests. Seir was the scribe. Benani, the son of Jehoiada, was over both the Cherites and the Pelahites. And David's sons were chief ministers. Verse 18 says, and on the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants I have given the land from the river of Egypt and to the great river Euphrates, the Canaanites, the Kenzites, the Kadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, and the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. We go, okay, why is that? Right? Why do we read this here in Genesis 15? The reason for it, what it does, it reminds us of this is exactly what happened with David. Exactly what took place. So, as we summarize basically this period of time, David's life in the kingdom of God was extended north, south, east, and west. And David's administration is really what we read just a moment ago. These back here, it's kind of like what we would call our president's cabinet. You know, that's really what this is. And they were basically one nation. We see they were one nation under God with justice and equality is what we see happening there. And it must have been a wonderful place to live as an Israelite during that time. And imagine, even those people that were servants that gave themselves over to the Israelites because they were beaten in war, we don't read of the Israelites in their history treating these people terrible. You know, we know later, of course, how they treat certain other brethren, really is what it is in other countries. But we see that it was a good place to be. You know, in our own Pledge of Allegiance, we say those words, you know, one nation under God with liberty and justice for all. And this is what David was getting at. Sometimes, you know, we may wonder, you know, if that is still true, but that's what our nation is supposed to be. And that's what we see. And I always think about that like our currency. Our currency says, you know, has God mentioned it? You know, trusting God and the importance behind it. And, you know, and I think it's an important thing to say, you know, people are like, why is that on our currency? Think about it. Don't trust in this money that it's printed on. Trust in God. And that's what we see ourselves today. So, brethren, as we close out with this, I'll close out one more time showing you the map of David's kingdom. This is what it is. And that's where we are today. And Wednesday we'll move on. But God has answered now the call of Abraham. That Abraham, what he would give him. And we'll see that happening. So any questions or comments before we close? Anybody else? Nope, we're going to close there. All right, thank you for your time.